Have you ever wondered what could be more dangerous than a Category 4 hurricane? Most people would say the wind, or maybe the massive waves, but they're wrong. Sometimes, the deadliest part of a disaster isn't the storm at all. It's the moment people convince themselves there's nothing to worry about. That's exactly what happened in Galveston, Texas. Back in 1900, Galveston was one of the richest cities on the Gulf Coast. It was busy, growing fast, and full of confidence. People believed they had a bright future ahead of them. There was just one problem. The highest natural point on the entire island was only about 8.7 feet, or 2.6 meters, above sea level. Then came a storm surge that reached around 15 feet, or 4.5 meters. Think about that for a second. The ocean didn't just flood the streets, it completely covered the land. In a matter of hours, homes, businesses, and entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath the water. By the time the hurricane was over, somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people were dead. Most historians believe the real number was close to 8,000. To this day, it remains the deadliest natural disaster in American history. But here's what really caught my attention. This wasn't a tragedy that came out of nowhere. The warning signs were there. People had seen similar disasters before. Some experts knew exactly what was happening. Others tried to sound the alarm. Yet somehow, the message never reached the people who needed it most. That's why this story isn't really about a hurricane. It's about what happens when confidence replaces caution, when authority drowns out evidence, and when a community believes it's safe simply because someone important says it is. And honestly, that's what makes the Galveston disaster feel so unsettling even today. Because storms will always come. The real question is whether we're willing to listen before it's too late. To really understand what happened, you have to understand what Galveston was like before the storm. This wasn't some small fishing village on the edge of the map. Galveston was one of the busiest and wealthiest cities in Texas. It was a major port. Ships came and went every day, bringing in goods from all over the world. Businesses were booming. New buildings were going up. Investors saw nothing but opportunity. People believed the city's future was unlimited. That confidence didn't come from nowhere. It was reinforced by someone the public trusted. His name was Isaac Klein. Klein wasn't just another weather observer. He was a respected government meteorologist. He was also a physician, a college professor, and someone many people looked up to. If he spoke about the weather, people listened. Few had any reason to question him. Then, in 1891, he published an article that would shape the way an entire city thought about hurricanes. Its message was simple. The Texas coast is not liable to serious damage from hurricanes. He argued that Galveston's location naturally protected. He believed the shallow Gulf waters would weaken any incoming storm before it could reach the city. He also believed that wind alone couldn't push enough water onto the island to cause catastrophic flooding. Based on what people knew at the time, it sounded reasonable, but it was wrong. The article went even further. Klein called the idea of a devastating hurricane striking Galveston an absurd delusion. In other words, he believed the fear itself was irrational. Those words carried enormous weight. Around the same time, some local leaders were pushing for a seawall. They had watched another Texas town, Indianola, get wiped out by hurricanes not once, but twice. To them, the warning was obvious. If it happened there, it could happen here. But after Klein's article was published, the conversation changed. Why spend millions on a seawall if the government's top weather expert says the city is already safe? The project lost support. Developers kept building closer to the shoreline. Businesses kept investing. More families moved in. Instead of preparing for the worst, Galveston became even more exposed. Looking back, that's probably the hardest part of this story. No one ignored the danger because they were careless. They ignored it because they genuinely believed they were protected. One respected expert. One confident prediction. One article that made people feel safe. Sometimes, that's all it takes for an entire city to let its guard down. And by the time anyone realized the mistake, there was no time left to fix it. The most frustrating part of this story is that the disaster didn't happen without warning. The warning was there. In fact, There were a lot of warnings. People just didn't connect the dots. Years before Galveston, another Texas town called Indianola had already lived through the nightmare. In 1875, a powerful hurricane destroyed the town and killed hundreds of people. The survivors rebuilt, hoping it was a once-in-a-lifetime tragedy. It wasn't. Just 11 years later, another hurricane hit. The damage was so complete that the people who survived simply gave up. They walked away and never came back. Indianola disappeared from the map. That alone should have made everyone along the Texas coast stop and think. But it didn't. Around the same time, another storm tore through Trinidad in the Caribbean, flattening homes and leaving behind the same pattern of destruction. It wasn't an isolated event. It was another piece of the puzzle. Then came the most important warning of all. In Havana, Cuba, meteorologists at the Belén Observatory were tracking the storm day by day. They weren't guessing. They were studying air pressure, wind direction, cloud patterns, and reports from ships crossing the Caribbean. By early September, they had reached a clear conclusion. The hurricane wasn't turning away. It was moving across the Gulf of Mexico, and the Texas coast was directly in its path. What's incredible is how accurate they were, especially considering this was 1900, long before satellites, radar, or Hurricane Hunter aircraft. But the evidence didn't stop there. On the morning before landfall, barometers around Galveston began falling much faster than normal. Anyone familiar with hurricanes knew that was a serious warning sign. Then something even stranger happened. Large ocean swells started rolling toward the beach, while the surface wind was blowing the opposite direction. That may not sound unusual today, but experienced weather observers knew exactly what it meant. A massive hurricane was pushing water across the Gulf, even though the center of the storm was still far offshore. Nature was practically announcing that something enormous was coming. When you put everything together, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. A town had already been destroyed twice. Another island had just been devastated. Cuban forecasters had predicted the storm's path. Air pressure was collapsing. The ocean itself was behaving in ways that experienced observers recognized immediately. Every piece of information pointed to the same conclusion. This was not going to be an ordinary storm. The tragedy is that the evidence wasn't hidden. It wasn't missing. It wasn't even complicated. The warnings were there for anyone willing to listen. Unfortunately, the people making the biggest decisions believed the storm wasn't a real threat. And once that belief took hold, every warning that followed became easier to dismiss. If there's one part of this story that really makes me angry, it's this one. Because at this point, the disaster wasn't just about nature anymore. It became about people making decisions that kept the truth from reaching the public. At the center of it all was Willis Luther Moore, the director of the U.S. Weather Bureau. Moore believed his agency represented the highest standard of weather science. He also believed that the meteorologists in Havana, Cuba, were undermining the authority of the American government, and that belief turned into a decision with devastating consequences. The meteorologists at Havana's Belén Observatory were among the best hurricane forecasters in the world. They had years of experience tracking storms across the Caribbean. Their forecasts were trusted by ship captains from many different countries because they were usually right. When they warned that the storm was heading toward Texas, their message should have been taken seriously. Instead, it was pushed aside. Moore pressured Western Union to give priority to official U.S. Weather Bureau telegrams. Cuban weather reports could be delayed or ignored. On top of that, he restricted communication inside his own agency, making it much harder for critical information from Havana to reach forecasters in the United States. Then came another decision that's hard to believe today. He didn't want government forecasts, using words like hurricane, cyclone, or tornado. He thought those words would create unnecessary panic. So instead of warning people about a dangerous hurricane, official bulletins described it as nothing more than a moderate storm. Imagine hearing that. If you're a business owner, you stay open. If you're a parent, you keep your family at home. If you're a city official, you don't order a large evacuation. Because the people in charge are telling you there's nothing unusual to worry about, and that's exactly what happened. While Cuban forecasters correctly tracked the hurricane moving across the Gulf of Mexico, The official American forecast claimed it would turn toward Florida and continue up the East Coast. Nearly every part of that prediction was wrong. Meanwhile, Isaac Klein was watching the barometer fall in Galveston. The numbers didn't match the forecast coming from Washington. Even he could sense that something wasn't right. But official orders were official orders. He had been taught to trust the system. Looking back, that's one of the hardest lessons from this disaster. The science wasn't the biggest failure. The information already existed. The real failure happened when pride became more important than evidence. When protecting an institution's reputation mattered more than sharing the best available warning. Thousands of people never had the chance to make their own decision because they never received the full truth. That's what makes this story so painful. The hurricane couldn't be stopped, but the silence surrounding it was a choice. And sometimes, the cost of protecting an institution's image is measured not in headlines or careers, it's measured in human lives. Looking back today, it's easy to ask one question. How could someone as educated and experienced as Isaac Klein get it so wrong? The truth is, he wasn't careless. He was working with the best knowledge available at the time. The problem was that some of that knowledge was incomplete, and a few critical assumptions turned out to be completely wrong. The first mistake was how he understood storm surge. Like many scientists in the late 1800s, Klein believed the biggest danger from a hurricane was the wind. Strong winds could tear roofs off houses, knock down trees, and destroy buildings. That part was true, but he underestimated the real killer. Water. A hurricane doesn't just bring heavy rain, it pushes an enormous wall of ocean ahead of it. That surge can rise several feet above normal sea level and keep moving inland with incredible force. Once that happens, almost nothing in its path can stop it. In Galveston, the wind caused damage. The water erased the city. The second mistake involved the Gulf itself. Klein believed the shallow waters off the Texas coast would weaken incoming waves before they reached land. On paper, that sounded logical. But nature worked the opposite way. A wide, shallow continental shelf doesn't absorb storm surge. It actually helps build it up. As the water is forced into shallower areas, it has nowhere to go except higher. The very geography Klein thought would protect Galveston became one of the main reasons the flooding was so catastrophic. Then came the third mistake. It wasn't really about science. It was about what people did with the land. For years, developers removed the island's natural sand dunes. The sand was used to fill low streets and make new construction easier. Those dunes weren't huge, but they were one of the few natural barriers standing between the Gulf and the city. Little by little, they disappeared. Klein didn't order the dunes to be removed, but his public claim that Galveston was safe made those decisions much easier to justify. If respected experts said a devastating hurricane was almost impossible, why protect against one? That's how small decisions started adding up. No seawall was built. The natural dunes were gone. More buildings went up near the shoreline. Everything looked like progress. In reality, the city's defenses were being stripped away one step at a time. That's probably the biggest lesson here. Disasters rarely happen because of one huge mistake. They're usually the result of several reasonable decisions that all point in the wrong direction. By themselves, each choice seemed harmless. Together, they created the perfect conditions for one of the deadliest disasters in American history. By the morning of the 8th of September 1900, everything that had been building for days was finally coming together. The problem was, almost no one realized how little time they had left. Around 5 a.m., Isaac Klein was told something didn't feel right. The tide was already unusually high in the low parts of the city, and the wind wasn't behaving the way it normally would. So he climbed into his horse-drawn buggy and headed toward the beach. What he saw immediately caught his attention. Long, powerful swells were rolling in from the Gulf, even though the local wind was blowing the opposite direction. To an experienced weather observer, that was a huge red flag. It meant there was an extremely powerful hurricane out over the horizon, already pushing massive amounts of water toward the coast. For the first time, Klein realized this storm could be far more dangerous than anyone had expected. Around 10:30 that morning, a message finally arrived from Washington, ordering storm warning flags to be raised. Klein followed the order. But he also did something unusual. Without waiting for additional approval, he raised the full hurricane warning on his own. It was the first time in his career that he chose to act before getting official permission. Deep down, he knew the situation was getting worse. The problem was that the warning came far too late. By around 3 p.m., entire neighborhoods were already underwater. Many people still didn't believe the danger was real. Some actually walked to the beach just to watch the waves. Others stood outside watching bathhouses break apart in the wind, treating the storm almost like a spectacle. They had no idea those wooden buildings were about to become deadly weapons. As the structures collapsed, huge beams and broken boards were thrown through the air like missiles. By 5 p.m., the hurricane was in full control. The wind screamed through the city. Roof tiles lifted off houses. Brick chimneys collapsed. Glass exploded out of windows. Wood, bricks, and pieces of metal flew through the streets at terrifying speeds. Simply stepping outside could be fatal. Inside the Weather Bureau office, instruments began failing one after another as the pressure dropped lower than anyone had ever recorded there before. Meanwhile, Isaac Klein had gone home. His house stood only a few feet above sea level. He had designed it himself, believing it could survive the strongest storm he could imagine. Nearly 50 people had gathered inside, hoping it would be the safest place in the neighborhood. They moved everyone upstairs, thinking that if the lower floor flooded, the second story would protect them. Then came the moment survivors would never forget. At about 7:30 p.m., the water didn't slowly creep in. It exploded across the island. Many witnesses later described the exact same thing. The water rose about 4 feet in just a few seconds, not over several minutes, not over an hour, just seconds. It wasn't a rising tide anymore. It was a moving wall of ocean. Within moments, water around Klein's house was already waist-deep. Then it kept climbing. The house began shaking violently. Outside, massive pieces of debris were being carried by the surge. One section of railroad tracks slammed directly into the house with incredible force. That impact was enough. The entire structure broke apart. Of the roughly 50 people sheltering inside, 32 died almost instantly. Among them was Isaac Klein's wife, Cora. Klein himself was thrown underwater as the house collapsed around him. When he finally surfaced, he wasn't standing in his neighborhood anymore. He was clinging to floating wreckage in complete darkness, surrounded by what had once been the streets of Galveston. By midnight, the winds had finally begun to fade. But the city that had existed that morning was gone. In just a few hours, Galveston had been transformed from one of the wealthiest cities on the Gulf Coast into the deadliest disaster scene in American history. When the sun came up on the 9th of September 1900, the storm was gone. But so was the city people thought they knew. The water had pulled back almost as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a place that barely looked recognizable. Entire neighborhoods had simply vanished. Not damaged, not flooded. Gone. More than 3,600 homes had been completely destroyed. In many parts of the island, there wasn't even enough left to tell where a house had once stood. Nearly half of Galveston's residential area had been wiped off the map. Families who had gone to sleep under a roof the night before woke up surrounded by splintered lumber, broken furniture, and endless piles of debris. Some survivors couldn't even find the streets they had lived on. The landmarks they had known their entire lives were gone. And then there was the human loss. No one will ever know the exact number of people who died. The official estimates range from 6,000 to 12,000, with about 8,000 considered the most likely figure. Think about that for a moment. In just one night, Galveston lost a huge part of its population. Entire families disappeared. Neighbors vanished. Children, parents, grandparents, many were never found. For days, recovery crews searched through mountains of wreckage, hoping to find survivors. More often, they found bodies. There were simply too many victims and too few resources to handle the tragedy. The destruction was so overwhelming that many people struggled to describe what they were seeing. One of the people who witnessed it firsthand was Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross. She arrived in Galveston shortly after the disaster to help organize relief efforts. After seeing the city with her own eyes, she wrote that the devastation was beyond human conception for anyone who hadn't experienced it themselves. Coming from Clara Bartona, woman who had spent her life responding to wars and disasters, that statement carried enormous weight. What strikes me most is how quiet the city must have felt after the storm. The noise of the wind was gone. The crashing waves had stopped, but everywhere people looked, there were empty spaces where entire neighborhoods had once stood. The hardest part wasn't just counting what had been destroyed. It was realizing how many lives had disappeared with it. Galveston wasn't simply damaged that night. For a few terrible hours, it was almost erased from history. And even today, more than a century later, it remains the deadliest natural disaster the United States has ever experienced. Not because the hurricane was impossible to survive, but because the city never truly believed it needed to prepare for it. After a disaster like that, most people would have expected Galveston to be abandoned. Honestly, that's what happened to Indianola. People left, and they never came back. But Galveston made a very different choice. Instead of giving up on the island, they decided they were going to rebuild it. And this time, they were going to do it differently. The city accepted a hard truth. They couldn't stop hurricanes, but they could stop making the same mistakes. The first step was building something many people had argued for years, early-era seawall. Engineers designed a massive concrete wall stretching along the shoreline. It stood about 17 feet high, with a curved face that helped break the force of incoming waves instead of taking the full impact head-on. It wasn't a small project. It took years of planning, thousands of workers, and an enormous amount of money. But the seawall was only part of the solution. The next idea sounded almost impossible. Instead of moving the city somewhere safer, they decided to raise the city itself. Think about that for a second. Not one building, not one block, an entire city. Engineers placed thousands of homes, businesses, schools, churches, and public buildings on giant jacks. One by one, they slowly lifted the structures into the air, while people watched from temporary wooden walkways built above the streets. Once the buildings were raised, crews pumped millions of cubic yards of sand underneath them. Street by street, block by block, the ground itself became higher. Then the buildings were carefully lowered onto their new foundations. Roads were rebuilt, water lines were raised, streetcar tracks were rebuilt at the new elevation. Even massive stone churches weighing thousands of tons were lifted without being torn down. It's hard to imagine pulling off a project like that today, let alone more than a century ago. The cost was enormous. By the time everything was finished, Galveston had invested far more money than it would have spent if protective projects had been built before the 1900 hurricane. That's the painful irony. The city eventually paid the price anyway. The difference was that this time, it paid after thousands of people had already lost their lives. But the investment worked. When another major hurricane struck in 1909, the seawall held. Then came another powerful storm in 1915, one comparable to the hurricane that had devastated Galveston 15 years earlier. Again, the seawall held. The damage was still serious, but the loss of life was dramatically lower. Thousands of people who might have died were able to survive because the city had finally built the protection it once believed it didn't need. To me, that's one of the biggest lessons in this entire story. Preparing for disaster always feels expensive. Until you compare it to the cost of rebuilding after everything is gone. Galveston learned that lesson the hardest way possible. And it's a lesson many cities around the world are still struggling to learn today. You'd like to think a disaster like Galveston would only happen once. That after losing thousands of lives, we'd never repeat the same mistakes. But history has a way of proving us wrong. More than a century later, another hurricane changed the Gulf Coast forever. This time, it was Hurricane Katrina. The technology was completely different. Weather satellites, computer models, radar, and emergency planning had all come a long way since 1900. The forecast wasn't the problem anymore. Scientists knew Katrina was dangerous. Engineers had already studied what could happen if a powerful hurricane hit New Orleans. In fact, a federal emergency exercise known as Hurricane Pam had predicted a disaster that looked remarkably similar to what eventually happened. The risks were on paper. The flood scenarios had been modeled. People knew which levees were vulnerable. The information existed, but once again, knowing something and acting on it turned out to be two very different things. When Katrina struck in 2005, multiple floodwall sections failed, entire neighborhoods filled with water. Around 1,800 people lost their lives. It wasn't because no one saw the danger coming. It was because the warnings didn't lead to enough action before it was too late. Then, just a few years later, the Texas coast faced another major test. In 2008, Hurricane Ike made landfall near Galveston, following a path surprisingly similar to the storm that devastated the city in 1900. This time, though, the outcome was very different. The seawall built after the 1900 disaster did exactly what it was designed to do. Even though parts of the storm surge overtopped the wall, it greatly reduced the destruction. Just as important, mandatory evacuation orders had already moved thousands of people out of harm's way. The storm was still powerful, but the response was better. That's the difference preparation can make. When I look at these three hurricanes, Galveston, Katrina, and Ike, I don't just see different storms. I see the same lesson showing up in different generations. In every case, experts had forecasts. They had models. They had data. The real question was whether people were willing to act on what those warnings were telling them. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. And that's what history keeps reminding us. Natural disasters are often unavoidable. Human decisions aren't. The biggest lesson from Galveston isn't about hurricanes at all. It's about what happens when good information is ignored, delayed, or pushed aside because people believe everything will probably be fine. Storms don't care how confident we are. They only care whether we're ready when they arrive. So, after looking back at everything that happened in Galveston, I don't think this story is really about a hurricane anymore. The storm was powerful. There's no question about that. But what turned it into the deadliest natural disaster in American history wasn't just the weather. It was the choices people made before the storm ever arrived. People trusted confident predictions over uncomfortable evidence. Warnings were delayed. Critical information was dismissed. Protective projects were postponed because they seemed too expensive or unnecessary. One decision by itself didn't destroy Galveston. But when all of those decisions came together, the outcome became almost impossible to stop. That's the part that stays with me. Because this isn't really a story trapped in the year 1900. Every generation believes its technology is better. Its models are smarter. Its experts know more than the ones before them. And in many ways, that's true. Today's forecasts are more accurate than Isaac Klein or Willis Moore could have ever imagined. But having better technology doesn't automatically mean we'll make better decisions. That's still up to us. History has shown over and over that disasters become tragedies when people stop questioning their own assumptions. When confidence replaces humility. When protecting reputations becomes more important than facing uncomfortable facts. Galveston reminds us that nature doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care how advanced we think we are. It doesn't care about political arguments, public opinion, or optimistic forecasts. It simply follows the laws of physics. Maybe that's the biggest lesson this story leaves behind. The most dangerous thing isn't always the hurricane. It isn't the wind. It isn't even the rising water. Sometimes, the greatest danger is believing we've already figured nature out, believing we're too prepared to be surprised, believing the next disaster can't happen here because someone in authority says everything is under control. History suggests otherwise. Storms will always come. The only part we get to choose is whether we'll listen before they arrive or whether we'll convince ourselves, one more time, that everything will be fine until it's too late.